Chapters 33 and 34 of The Pawn's Count by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 33. Philip Downing very soon justified the profession to which he belonged by strolling off with some excuse about paying his respects to some acquaintances. Pamela and Lutchester immediately dropped the somewhat frivolous tone of their conversation. "You know that things are moving with our friend Fischer," she began. "I gathered so," Lutchester assented. "His scheme is growing into shape," she went on. "You know what wonderful people his friends are for organizing. Well, they are going to start a society all through the States and nominate for its president Uncle Theodore." "Will they have any show at all?" Lutchester asked curiously. She shrugged her shoulders. "Who can tell? The German Americans are very powerful indeed all through the West, and then the pacifists will join them. You see, I believe that although the soul of the country is with the Allies, England is the most tactless country in the world. She is always giving little pinpricks to the government over here, either about maritime law or one thing or another. Then all those articles in the papers about America being too proud to fight, the sneering tone of some, even of the leading reviews, did a lot of harm. Uncle Theodore is going to stand for what they call the true neutrality. That is to say, no munitions, no help for either side." "Well, I don't know anything about American politics," Lutchester confessed, "but I shouldn't think he'd have an earthly chance." "Money is immensely powerful," she went on reflectively, "and many of the great money interests of the country are controlled by German Americans. Mr. Fischer has almost thrown me over politically, but Uncle Theodore is crazy about the idea of a German pledge to protect America against Japan. That is going to be the great argument which he will keep up his sleeve until after the nomination." "Fischer's trump card," Lutchester observed. "He hasn't shown you a certain autographed letter yet, I suppose?" She shook her head. "He may have shown it to Uncle Theodore. I'm afraid he doesn't mean to approach me again. He seems to have completely changed his attitude towards me since the night he saw us at the Ritz-Carlton dining together. He was going to show me the letter the first day after his arrival in Washington. Instead of that, he has been in the house for hours at a time without making the slightest attempt to see me." "Faithless fellow," Lutchester murmured. "Nothing like an Englishman, after all, for absolute fidelity." "Do you really think so?" Pamela inquired anxiously. "Do you think I should be safe in trusting my heart and future to an Englishman?" "To one particular Englishman, yes," was the firm reply. "I was rather hoping you might have made up your mind." "Too many things to think about," she laughed. "How long are you going to stay in Washington?" "A few hours, or days, or weeks, until I have finished the work that brought me here." "And what exactly is that?" "You ask me lightly," he replied, "but if you are willing, I have decided to take you into my confidence. Our friend Nikasti will be here to-morrow. He was to have sailed for Japan yesterday, but he has postponed his voyage for a few days. Do you know much about the Japanese, Miss Pamela?" "Very little," she acknowledged. "Well, I will tell you one thing. They are not very good at forgiving. There was only one way I could deal with Nikasti in New York, and it was a brutal way. I have seen him twice since. He won't look me in the eyes. I know what that means. He hates me. In a sense, I don't believe he would allow that to interfere in any way with his mission. In another sense, it would. The Allies, above all things, have need of Japan. We want Japan and America to be friends. We don't want Germany butting in between the two. Baron Yung is a very clever man, but he is even more impenetrable than his countrymen generally are. Our people here admit that they find it difficult to progress with him very far. They believe that secretly he is in sympathy with Nikasti's reports. But you don't know about those, I suppose?" "I don't think I do," she admitted. "Nikasti was sent to England some years ago to report upon us as a country. Japan at that time was meditating an alliance with one of the great European powers. Obviously it must be Germany or England. Nikasti travelled all through England, studied our social life, measured our weaknesses, did the same through Germany, returned to Japan, and gave his vote in favour of Germany. I have even seen a copy of his report. He laid great stress upon the absolute devotion to the sport of our young men, and the entire absence of any patriotic sentiment or any means of national defence. Well, as you know, for various reasons, his counsels were overridden, and Japan chose the British alliance. That was entirely the fault of imperfect German diplomacy. At a time like this, though, I cannot help thinking that some elements of his former distrust still remained in Nikasti's mind, and I have an idea that Baron Yung is, to a certain extent, a sympathizer. I've got to get at the bottom of this before I leave the States. If I need your help, will you give it to me?" "If I can," she promised. They saw Mrs. Hastings' figure on the terrace, waving, and Pamela rose reluctantly to her feet. "I don't suppose," Lutchester continued as they strolled across the lawn, "that you have very much influence with your uncle, or that he would listen very much to anything that you have to say. But if he is really in earnest about this thing, he is going to play a terribly dangerous game. As things are at present, he has a very pleasant and responsible position as the supporter and friend of very able men. With regard to this movement, he may find the whole ground crumble away beneath his feet. Fischer is playing the game of a madman. It isn't only political defeat that might come to him, but disgrace, even dishonour." "You frighten me," Pamela confessed gravely. Lutchester sighed. "Your uncle," he went on, "is one of those thoroughly conceited, egotistical men who will probably listen to no one. You see, I have found out a little about him already, but they tell me that her social position means a great deal to your aunt. Neither her birth nor her friends could save her if Fischer dragged your uncle to his chariot wheels." "Do you think, perhaps, that you underestimate Mr. Fischer's position over here?" she asked thoughtfully. "I don't think I do," he replied. "But here is something which you have scarcely appreciated. Fischer has had the effrontery to link himself up with a little crowd of Germans all through the States, who are making organized attempts to destroy the factories where ammunitions are being made for the Allies. That sort of thing, you know, will bring any one, however distantly connected with it, to Sing Sing. One moment," he added quickly, as Mrs. Hastings stepped forward to meet them. "The reception at the British Embassy to night?" "The others are going," she said. "My aunt didn't feel she was sufficiently—" "We sent you a card round especially this afternoon," Lutchester interrupted. "You'll come?" "How nice of you! Of course I will," she promised. Chapter 34. "Small affair, this," Downing observed, as he piloted Lutchester through the stately reception rooms of the Embassy. "You see, we are all living a sort of touchy life here nowadays. We try to be civil to any of the German or Austrian lot when we meet, but of course they don't come to our functions. And every now and then some of those plaguey neutrals get the needle, and they don't come, so we never know quite where we are. Guadopolis has been avoiding us lately, and I hear he was seen out at the Lakewood Country Club with Count Reskov, the Romanian minister, a few days ago. Gave the chief quite a little flurry, that did." "There's an idea over in London," Lutchester remarked, "that a good deal of the war is being shaped in Washington nowadays." "That is the chief's notion," Downing assented. "I know he's pining to talk to you, so we'll go and do the dutiful." Lutchester was welcomed as an old friend by both the Ambassador and his wife. The former drew him to a divan from which he could watch the entrance to the rooms, and sat by his side. "I am glad they sent you out, Lutchester," he said earnestly. "If ever a country needed watching by a man with intelligence and experience, this one does to day." "Do you happen to know that fellow Oscar Fischer?" Lutchester asked. "I do, and I consider him one of the most dangerous people in the States for us," the Ambassador declared. "He has a great following, huge wealth, and although he is not a man of culture, he doesn't go about his job in that bull-headed way that most of them do." "He's trying things on with Japan," Lutchester observed. "I think I shall manage to checkmate him there all right. But there's another scheme afloat that I don't follow so closely. You know Senator Hastings, I suppose?" The Ambassador nodded. "Senator Theodore Hastings," he repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, he's rather a dark horse. He is supposed to be the President's bosom friend, but I hear whispers that he'd give his soul for a nomination, adopt any cause, or fight anyone's battle." "That's my own idea of him," Lutchester replied, "and I think you will find him in the field with a pretty definite platform before long." "You think he's mixed up with Fischer?" the Ambassador inquired. "I'm sure he is," Lutchester assented. "Not only that, but they have something up their sleeve. I think I can guess what it is, but I'm not sure. How have things seemed to you here lately?" "To tell you the truth, I haven't liked the look of them," the Ambassador confided. "There's something afoot, and I can't be sure what it is. Look at the crowd tonight. Of course, all the Americans are here, but the diplomatic attendance has never been so thin. The Romanian Minister and his wife, the Italian, the Spanish, and the Swedish representatives are all absent. I have just heard, too, that Baron von Schwerin is giving a dinner party." Lutchester looked thoughtfully at the little stream of people. The Ambassador left him for a few moments to welcome some late comers. He returned presently and resumed his seat by Lutchester's side. "Of course," he continued, lowering his voice, "all formal communications between us and the enemy embassies have ceased, but it has come to be an understood thing, to avoid embarrassments to our mutual friends, that we do not hold functions on the same day. I heard that von Schwerin was giving this dinner party, so I sent round this morning to inquire. The reply was that it was entirely a private one. One of our youngsters brought us in a list of the guests a short time ago. I see Hastings is one of them, and Fischer, and Romania and Greece will be represented. Now, Hastings was to have been there, and as a rule the neutrals are very punctilious." "I suppose that way the naval affair was represented didn't do us any good," Lutchester observed. "It did us harm, without a doubt," was the lugubrious admission. "Still, unfortunately, these people over here are clever enough to understand our idiosyncrasies. I honestly think we'd rather whine about a defeat than glory in a victory." "Diplomatically, too," Lutchester remarked thoughtfully, "I should have said that things seemed all right here. The President comes in for a great deal of abuse in some countries. Personally, I think he has been wonderful." The Ambassador nodded. "You and I both know, Lutchester," he said, "that the last thing we want is to find America dragged into this war. Such a happening would be nothing more nor less than a catastrophe in itself, to say nothing of the internal dissensions here. On the other hand, as things are now, Washington is becoming a perfect arena for diplomatic chicanery, and I have just an instinct, I can't define it in any way, which leads me to believe that some fresh trouble has started within the last 24 hours." Lady Ridlingshaw motioned to her husband with her fan, and he rose at once to his feet. "I must leave you to look after yourself for a time, Lutchester," he concluded. "You'll find plenty of people here you know. Don't go until you've seen me again." Lutchester wandered off in search of Pamela. He found her with Mrs. Hastings, surrounded by a little crowd of acquaintances. Pamela waved her fan, and they made way for him. "Mr. Lutchester, I have been looking everywhere for you," she exclaimed. "What a secretive person you are! Why couldn't you tell me that Lady Ridlingshaw was your cousin? I want you to take me to her, please. I met her sister out in Nice." She laid her fingers upon his arm, and they passed out of the little circle. "All bluff, of course," she murmured. "Find the quietest place you can. I want to talk to you." They wandered out onto a balcony where some of the younger people were taking ices. She leaned over the wooden rail. "Listen," she said. "I adore this atmosphere, and I am perfectly certain there is something going on. Something exciting, I mean. You know that Baron von Schwerin has a dinner party?" "I know that," he assented. "Uncle Theodore is going with Mr. Fischer. He was invited at the last moment, and I understand that his presence was specially requested." Lutchester stood for a short time in an absorbed and sombre silence. In the deep blue twilight his face seemed to have fallen into sterner lines. Without a doubt he was disturbed. Pamela looked at him anxiously. "Is anything the matter?" she asked. He shook his head. "Nothing definite. Only, for the last few hours, I have felt that things here are reaching a crisis. There is something going on around us, something which seems to fill Fischer and his friends with confidence, something which I don't quite understand, and which it is my business to understand. That is really what is worrying me." She nodded sympathetically, and glanced around for a moment. "Let me tell you something," she whispered. "This evening my uncle came into my room just before dinner. There was a little safe built in the wall for jewellery. He begged for the loan of it. His library safe, he said, was out of order. I couldn't see what he put in, but when he closed the door he stood looking at it for a moment curiously. I made some jesting remark about its being a treasure chest, but he answered me serious." "You are going to sleep to-night, Pamela," he said, "within a few yards of a dozen or so of written words which will change the world's history." Lutchester was listening intently. There was a prolonged pause. "Well?" he asked at last. She glanced at the little Yale key which hung from her bracelet. "Nothing. I was just wondering how I should be able to sleep through the night without opening the safe." "But surely your uncle didn't give you the key?" She shook her head. "I don't suppose he knows I have such a thing," she replied. "He is a master key himself to all the safes, which he used. This is the one the housekeeper gave me as soon as I arrived." Lutchester looked out into the darkness. "Tell me," he inquired, "is that your house, the next one to this?" "That's the old Hastings house," she assented. "They are all family mansions along here." "It looks like an easy place to burgle," he remarked. She laughed quietly. "I should think it would be," she admitted. "There are any quantity of downstairs windows. We don't have burglaries in Washington, though. Certainly not this side of the city." A little bevy of young people had found their way into the gardens. Lutchester waited until they had passed out of earshot before he spoke again. "I have reason to believe," he continued, "that in the course of their negotiations Fischer has deposited with your uncle a certain autograph letter, of which we have already spoken, making definite proposals to America if she will change her attitude on the neutrality question." "The written words," Pamela murmured. Lutchester's hand suddenly closed upon her wrist. She was surprised to find his fingers so cold, yet marvellously tenacious. "You are going to lose that key, and I am going to find it," he said quietly. "I am sorry, but you must." "I am going to do nothing of the sort," Pamela objected. His fingers remained like a cold vice upon her wrist. She made no effort to draw it away. "Listen," he said. "Do you believe that the Hastings cum Fischer party is going to be the best thing that could happen for America?" "I certainly do not," she admitted. "Then do as I beg. Let me take that key from your bracelet. You shall have no other responsibility." "And what are you going to do with it?" "You must leave that to me," he answered. "I will tell you as much as I can. I stopped Nikasti sailing for Japan, but I made a mortal enemy of him at the same time. He has come to Washington to consult with his ambassador. They are together to-night. It is my mission to convince them of Germany's duplicity." "I see. And you think that these written words—" "Give the key to me," he begged, "and ask no questions." She shook her head. "I should object most strongly to nocturnal disturbers of my slumbers." It seemed to her that his frame had become tenser, his tone harder. The grip of his fingers was still upon her wrist. "Even your objection," he said, "might not relieve you of the possibility of their advent." "Don't be silly," she answered. "And above all, don't try to threaten me. If you want my help—" She looked steadfastly across at the looming outline of the Hastings house. "I do want your help," he assured her. "How long should you require the letter for?" "1 hour," he replied. She led him down some steps onto the smooth lawns which encircled the house. They passed in and out of some gigantic shrubs until at last they came to a paling. She felt along it for a few yards. "There is a gate there," she told him. "Can you do anything with it?" It was fastened by an old lock. He lifted it off its hinges, and they both passed through. "Keep behind the shrubs as much as you can," she whispered. "There is a way into the house from the veranda here." They reached at last the shadow of the building. She paused. "Wait here for me," she continued. "I would rather enter the house without being seen, if I can. But it doesn't really matter. I can make some excuse for coming back. Don't move from where you are." She glided away from him and disappeared. Lutchester waited, standing well back in the shadow of the shrubs. From the Embassy came all the time the sound of music, occasionally even the murmur of voices. From the dark house in front of him, nothing. Suddenly he heard what seemed to be the opening of a window, and then saw footsteps. Pamela appeared round the corner of the building, a white spectral figure against that background of deep blue darkness. She came on tiptoe, running down the steps and holding her skirts with both hands. "Not a soul has seen me," she whispered. "Take this quickly." She thrust an envelope into his hands, and something hard with it. "That's Uncle Theodore's seal," she explained. "He sealed up the envelope when he put it in there. Now come back quickly to the Embassy. You must please hurry with what you want to do."
If I have left when you return, you must come back to exactly this place. That window," she pointed upwards, "will be wide open. You must throw a pine cone or a pebble through it. I shall be waiting." "I understand," he assured her. They retraced their steps. Once more they drew near to the Embassy. The night had grown warmer, and more windows had been opened. They reached the veranda. She touched his hand for a moment. "Well," she said, "I don't know whether I have been wise or not. Try and be back in less than an hour, if you can. I am going in alone." She left him, and Lutchester, after a few brief words with the Ambassador, hurried away to his task. In 20 minutes he stood before a tall, grey-stone building a few blocks away, was admitted by a Japanese butler, and conducted after some hesitation into a large room at the back of the house. An elderly man, dressed for the evening, with the lapel of his coat covered with orders, was awaiting him. "I am a stranger to you, Baron," Lutchester began. "That does not matter," was the grave reply. "10 minutes ago I had an urgent telephone call from our mutual friend. His Excellency told me that he was sending a special messenger, and begged me to give you a few minutes. I have left a conference of some importance, and I am here." "A few minutes will be enough," Lutchester promised. "I am engaged by the English Government upon Secret Service work. I came to America following a man named Fischer. You have heard of him?" "I have heard of him," the Ambassador acknowledged. "In New York," Lutchester continued, "he met one of your countrymen, Prince Nikasti, a man, I may add," Lutchester went on, "for whom I have the highest respect and esteem, although quite openly, years ago, he pronounced himself unfavourably disposed towards my country. The object of Fischer's meeting with Prince Nikasti was to convey to him certain definite proposals on behalf of the German Government. They wish for a rapprochement with your country. They offer certain terms, confirmation of which Fischer brought with him in an autographed letter." There was a moment's silence. Not a word came from the man who seemed to have learnt the gift of sitting with absolute immovability. Even his eyes did not blink. He sat and waited. "The proposals made to you are plausible and deserving of consideration," Lutchester proceeded. "Do not think that there exists in my mind, or would exist in the mind of any Englishman knowing of them, any feeling of resentment that these proposals should have been received by you for consideration. Nothing in this world counts to those who follow the arts of diplomacy, save the simple welfare of the people whom he represents. It is therefore the duty of every patriot to examine carefully all proposals made to him likely to militate to the advantage of his own people. You have a letter offering you certain terms to withdraw from your present alliances. Here is a letter from the same source, in the same handwriting, written to America. Break the seal yourself. It was brought to this country by Fischer, in the same dispatch box as yours, to be handed to some responsible person in the American Government. It was handed to Senator Theodore Hastings. It is to form part of his platform on the day when his nomination as President is announced. It must be back in his safe within 3/4 of an hour. Break the seal and read it." The Japanese held out his hand, broke the seal of the envelope, and read. His face remained immovable. When he had finished, he looked up at his visitor. "I am permitted to take a copy?" he asked. "Certainly." He touched a bell, spoke down a mouthpiece, and with almost necromantic swiftness 2 young men were in the room. A camera was dragged out, a little flash of light shot up to the ceiling, and the attachés vanished as quickly as they had come. The Ambassador replaced the document in its envelope, handed a stick of sealing wax and a candle to Lutchester, who leaned over and resealed the envelope. "The negative?" he inquired. "Will be kept under lock and key," the Ambassador promised. "It will pass into the archives of Japanese history. In future we shall know." Once more he touched a bell. The door was opened. Lutchester found himself escorted into the street. He was back at the Embassy in time to meet a little stream of departing guests. Lady Ridlingshaw patted him on the shoulder with her fan. "Deserter!" she exclaimed reproachfully. "Wherever have you been hiding?" Lutchester made some light reply, and passed on. He made his way out into the gardens. The darkness now was a little more sombre, and he had to grope his way to the palings. Soon he stood before the dark outline of the adjoining house.
In the window towards which he was making his way, a single candle in a silver candlestick was burning. He paused underneath and listened. Then he took a pine cone which he had picked up on his way, and threw it through the open window. The candle was withdrawn. A shadowy form leaned out.
"I'm quite alone," she assured him softly. "Can you throw it in?"
He nodded. "I think so." His first effort was successful. The seal followed, wrapped up in his handkerchief. A moment or two later he saw Pamela's face at the window.
"Good night," she whispered. "Quickly, please. There is still someone about downstairs."
The light was extinguished. Lutchester made his way cautiously back, replaced the gate upon its hinges, and reached the shelter of the Embassy, denuded now of guests. He found Downing in the smoking room. "Can I get a whisky and soda?" Lutchester asked in response to the latter's vociferous greeting. "Call it a highball," was the prompt reply, "and you can have as many as you like. Have you earned it?" he added, a little curiously. "I almost believe that I have," Lutchester assented. Chapter 34. Recording by Tom Weiss. Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapters 35, 36, and 37 of The Pawn's Count by E. Phillips Oppenheim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 35. Mr. Oscar Fischer and his friend Senator Theodore Hastings stood side by side a week later in the bar of one of the most fashionable of New York hotels. They were passing away the few minutes before Pamela and her aunt would be ready to join them in the dining room above. "Very little news, I fancy," Hastings remarked, glancing at the tape which was passing through his companion's fingers. "Nothing of any importance," Fischer replied. "Nothing." The older man glanced searchingly at his companion, the change in whose tone was ominous. Fischer was standing with the tape in his hand, his eyes glued upon a certain paragraph. The Senator took out his eyeglasses and looked over his friend's shoulders. "What's this?" he demanded, "eh?" Fischer was fighting a great battle and fighting it well. "Something wrong apparently with Frank Roughton," he observed. "An old college friend of mine. They made him governor of only last year." Hastings read the item thoughtfully. "Governor Roughton this morning tendered his resignation as governor of the state of. We understand that it was at once accepted. Numerous arrests have taken place with reference to the great explosion at the Pembridge powder factory." "Looks rather fishy, that," Hastings observed thoughtfully. "I'm sorry for Roughton," Fischer declared. "He was a perfectly straight man, and I am sure he has done his best." "Great friend of yours?" the other asked curiously. "We were intimately acquainted," was the brief answer. The two men finished their cocktails in silence. On their way upstairs the Senator took his companion's arm. "Fischer," he said, "you'll forgive me if I put a certain matter to you plainly?" "Naturally." "Within the last few days," Hastings proceeded, "there have been 7 explosions or fires at various factories throughout the States. It is a somewhat significant circumstance," he added, after a slight pause, "that every one of these misfortunes has occurred at a factory where munitions of some sort for the Allies have been in the process of manufacture. Shrewd men have naturally come to the conclusion that there is some organization at work." "I should doubt it," Fischer replied. "You must remember that there is always a great risk of disasters in factories where explosives are being handled. It is a new thing to many of the manufacturers here, and it is obvious that they are not making use of all the necessary precautions." "I see," Hastings observed reflectively. "So that is how you would explain this epidemic of disasters, eh?" "Certainly." "At the same time, Fischer, to set my mind entirely at rest," Hastings continued, "I should like your assurance that you have nothing whatever to do with any organization, should there be such a thing, including in its object the destruction of American property." "I will do more than answer your question in the direct negative," was the firm reply. "I will assure you that no such organization exists." "I am relieved to hear it," Hastings confessed. "This resignation of Roughton, however, seems a strange thing. Most of these fires have occurred in his state. Ah, there is Senator Joyce waiting for us, and Pamela, and Mrs. Hastings." Mr. Hastings as a host was in his element. His manners and tact, which his enemies declared were far too perfect, were both admirably displayed in the smaller ways of life. He guided the conversation into light yet opportune subjects, and he utterly ignored the fact that Senator Joyce, one of the great politicians of the day, whose support of his nomination was already more than half promised, seemed distraught and a little cold. It was Pamela who quite inadvertently steered the conversation into a dangerous channel.
"What has Governor Roughton been doing, Mr. Fischer?" she asked.
There was a moment's silence. Pamela's question had fallen something like a bombshell amongst the little party. It was their guest who replied. "The matter is occupying the attention of the country very largely at the moment, Miss Van Tale," he said. "It is perhaps unfortunate that Governor Roughton seems to have allowed his sympathies to be so clearly known."
"He is German by birth, is he not?"
Pamela inquired. "Most decidedly not," Fischer asserted. "I was at Harvard with him."
"All the same," Pamela murmured under her breath, "I think that he was born at Stuttgart."
"He is an American citizen," Senator Joyce observed, "and has reached a high position here. We of the administration may be wrong," he continued, "but we believe, and we think that we have a right to believe, that when any man of conscience and ideals takes the oath, he is free from all previous prejudices. He is an American citizen. Nothing more and nothing less."
"Of course, that is magnificent," Pamela declared. "But it isn't common sense, is it? And you haven't answered my original question yet."
"I'm not in a position to do so, Miss Van Tale," Joyce replied. "The trouble probably is that Governor Roughton has been considered incompetent, as so many of these disasters have taken place unhindered in his state."
"There was a rumour," Pamela persisted, "that he was under arrest."
"Quite untrue, I am sure," Fischer muttered. There was a general diversion of the conversation, but the sense of uneasiness remained. Pamela and Mrs. Hastings, at the conclusion of the little banquet, acting upon a hint from their host, made their way to one of the small drawing rooms for their coffee. Left alone, the three men drew their chairs closer together. Joyce's fine face seemed somehow to have become a little harder and more unsympathetic. He sipped the water, which was his only beverage, and pushed away the cigars in which he generally indulged. "Mr. Hastings," he pronounced, "I have given the subject of supporting your nomination my deepest consideration. I was at one time, I must confess, favourably disposed towards the idea. I have changed my mind. I have decided to give my support to the present administration." Fischer's face was dark with anger. He even allowed an expletive to escape from his lips. Hastings, however, remained master of himself. "I will not conceal from you, Mr. Joyce," he confessed, "that I am exceedingly disappointed. You have fully considered everything, I presume. Our pledge, for instance, to nominate you as my successor?" "I have considered everything," Joyce replied. "The drawback, in my mind, to be frank with you, is that I doubt whether you would receive sufficient support throughout the country. It is my idea," he went on, "although I may be wrong, of course, that the support of the German Americans, who, you must allow me to maintain, are an exceedingly unneutral part of America, will place you in an unpopular position. Should you succeed in getting yourself elected, which I very much doubt, you will be an unpopular president. I would rather wait my time." "You have changed your views," Fischer muttered. "To be perfectly frank with you, I have," Joyce acknowledged. "These outrages throughout the States are, to my mind, blatant and criminal. Directly or indirectly, the German American public is responsible for them. Indirectly by inflammatory speeches, reckless journalism, and point-blank laudation of illegal acts. Directly, well, here I can speak only from my own suspicions, so I will remain silent. But my mind is made up. A man in this country, as you know," he added, "need only make one mistake and his political future is blasted. I am not inclined to risk making that one mistake." Hastings sighed. He was making a brave effort to conceal a great disappointment. "One cannot argue with you, Mr. Joyce," he regretted. "You have come to a certain conclusion, and words are not likely to alter it. There is no one I would so dearly have loved to number amongst my supporters, but I see that it is a privilege for which I may not hope. We will, if you are ready, Fischer, join the ladies." They rose from the table a few minutes later. Fischer, who had been eagerly watching his opportunity, drew Senator Joyce on one side for a moment as they passed down the crowded corridor. "Mr. Joyce," he said, "I have heard your decision to night with deeper regret than I can express. Yet more than ever it has brought home one truth to me. Our position towards you was a wrong one. We offered you a reversion when we should have offered you the thing itself." Senator Joyce swung around. "Say, Mr. Fischer, what are you getting at?" he asked bluntly. "I mean that it is Hastings and I who should have been your supporters, and you should have been our candidate," Fischer suggested boldly. "What about it? It isn't too late." "Nothing doing, sir," was the firm reply. "Theodore Hastings may not be exactly my type of man, but I am not out to see him cornered like that. And besides, to tell you the honest truth, Mr. Fischer," he added, pausing at the door, "when I stand for the Presidency, I want to do so not on the nomination of you or your friends, or any underground schemers. I want the support of the real American citizen. I want to be free from all outside ties and obligations. I want to stand for America, and America only. I not only want to be President, you see, but I want to be the chosen President of the right sort of people. I am going to ask you to excuse me to the ladies and our host, Mr. Fischer," he concluded, holding out his hand. "I had a note asking me to visit the Attorney General, which I only received on my way here. I have an idea that it is about this Roughton business." Fischer returned to the others alone. Hastings was clearly disturbed at his guest's departure. His friend and supporter, however, affected to treat it lightly. "Joyce is like all these lawyers," he declared. "He is simply waiting to see which way the wind blows. I have come across them many times. They like to wait till parties are evenly balanced, till their support makes all the difference, and clinch their bargain then." "I should have said," Pamela remarked, "that Mr. Joyce was a man above that sort of thing." "Every man has his price and his weak spot," her uncle observed didactically. "Joyce's price is the Presidency. His weak spot is popular adulation. I agree with Fischer. He will probably join us later." Mr. Hastings was summoned to the telephone a moment or two later. Mrs. Hastings sat down to write a note, and Pamela moved her place over to Fischer's side. His face brightened at her spontaneous movement. She shook her head, however, at the little compliment with which he welcomed her. "This afternoon," she said softly, "I met Mr. Lutchester." "Is he back in New York?" Fischer asked, frowning. Pamela nodded. "He told me something which I feel inclined to tell you," she continued, glancing into her companion's haggard face with a gleam of sympathy in her eyes. "You'll probably see it in the newspapers to-morrow morning. Governor Roughton's resignation was compulsory. He is under arrest." "For negligence?" "For participation," was the grave reply. "Mr. Lutchester has been down to the city where the things took place. He only got back late this afternoon." "Lutchester again," Fischer muttered. "You see, it's rather in his line," Pamela reminded him. "He is over here to superintend the production of munitions from the factories which are working for the British Government." "He is over here as a sort of general mischief maker!" Fischer exclaimed fiercely. "Do I understand that he has been down in—" Pamela nodded. "He went down with one of the heads of the New York police." She turned away, but Fischer caught at her wrist. "You know more than this!" he cried hoarsely. The agony in the man's face and tone touched her. After all, he was fighting for the great things. There was nothing mean about Fischer, nothing selfish about his lying and his crimes. "I have told you all that I can," she whispered. "But if you hurried, you could catch the New York tonight, and I think I should advise you to go." End of chapter 35. Chapter 36. Fischer, on leaving his unsuccessful dinner party, drove direct to the residence of Mr. Max H. Bookham in Fifth Avenue. The butler who admitted him looked a little blank at his inquiry. "Mr. Bookham was expected home yesterday, sir," he announced. "He has not arrived, however." "Has there been any telegram from him? Any news as to the cause of his non-return?" Fischer persisted. "I believe that Mr. Kay, his secretary, has some information, sir," the man admitted. "Perhaps you would like to see him." Fischer did not hesitate, and was conducted at once to the study in which Mr. Bookham was wont to indulge in various nefarious stock exchange adventures. The room was occupied on this occasion by a dejected-looking young man with pasty face and gold spectacles. The apartment, as Fischer was quick to notice, showed signs of a strange disorder. "Where's Mr. Bookham?" he asked quickly. The young man walked to the door, shook it to be sure that it was closed, and came back again. His tone was ominous, almost dramatic. "In the State Prison, sir," he announced. "What for?" Fischer demanded, breathing a little thickly. "I have no certain information," the secretary replied with a non-committal air. "All I know is that I had a long-distance telephone to burn certain documents, but before I could do so the room and the house were searched by New York detectives, whose warrant it was useless to resist." "But what's the charge against Mr. Bookam?" "It's something to do with the disasters," the young man confided. "The governor of the state, who is Mr. Bookam's cousin, is in the same trouble. Better sit down a moment, sir. You're looking white." Mr. Fischer threw himself into an easy chair. He felt like a man who has built a mighty piece of machinery, has set it swinging through space, and watches now its imminent collapse. Watches some tiny but ghastly flaw, pregnant with disaster, growing wider and wider before his eyes. "What papers did the police take away with them?" he asked. "There wasn't very much for them," the secretary replied. "There was a list of names of the proposed organization which, owing to your very wise intervention, was never formed. There was a list of factories throughout the United States in which munitions are being made, with a black mark against those holding the most important contracts. And there was a letter from Governor Roughton." "Mr. Bookam hasn't drawn any checks lately for large amounts?" Fischer inquired eagerly. "There are 3 in his private cheque book, sir, the counterfoils of which are not filled in," was the somewhat dreary admission. Fischer groaned as he received the news. "Have you any idea about those checks?" he demanded. "I am afraid," the other acknowledged, "that Mr. Bookam was not very discreet. I reminded him of your advice, that the money should be passed through Sullivan, but he didn't seem to think it worth while." "Look here, let me know the worst at once," Fischer insisted. "Do you believe that any one of these checks was made payable to any of the men who are under arrest?" "I am afraid," the secretary declared sadly, "that the proceeds of one were found on the person of Ed Swindles, intact." Fischer sat for a moment with his head buried in his hands. That any man could have been such a fool! An organization would have been 1,000 times safer. Max Bookam was only a very worthy and industrious clothing manufacturer, with an intense love for the fatherland and a great veneration for all our institutions. What he had done wholeheartedly, but foolishly. He was a man who should never have been trusted for a moment in the game. After all, the pawns count. Fischer took his leave and reached his hotel a little before midnight. Already he had begun to look over his shoulder in the street. He found his rooms empty with a sense of relief, marred by one little disappointment. Nikasti was to have been there to bid him farewell. Nikasti on his way back to Japan. He ascertained from the office of the hotel that there had been no telephone message or caller. Then he turned to his correspondence, some presentiment already clutching at his strained nerves. There was a letter in a large envelope near the bottom of the pile, addressed to him in Nikasti's fine handwriting. He tore open the envelope, and slow horror seized him as he realized its contents. A long photograph unrolled itself before his eyes. The first few words brought confusion and horror to his sense. His brain reeled. This was defeat indeed. It was a photograph of that other autographed letter. The one which he had given to Nikasti to carry to Japan lay, gross sacrilege, about him in small pieces. There was no other line, no message, nothing but this damning proof of his duplicity. A kind of mental torture seized him. He fought like a caged man for some way out. Every sort of explanation occurred to him only to be rejected, every sort of subterfuge only to be cast aside with a kind of ghastly contempt. He felt suddenly stripped bare. His tongue could serve him no more. He snatched at the telephone receiver and rang up the number for which he searched eagerly through the book. "Is that the office of the American Steamship Company?" he asked. "Yes." "What time will the New York sail?" "In 3/4 of an hour. Who's speaking?" "Mr. Oscar Fischer. Keep anything you have for me." He threw down the receiver for fear of a refusal, packed a few things feverishly in a dressing bag, dashed the rest of his correspondence into his pocket, and with the bag in one hand and an overcoat over the other arm, he hastened out into the street. He was obliged at first to board a street car. Afterwards he found a taxicab, and drove under the great wooden shed as the last siren was blowing. He hurried up the gangway, a grim, remorseful figure, a sense of defeat gnawing at his heart, a bitter, haunting fear still with him even when, with the shriek of the tugs, the great steamer swung into the river.
He was leaving forever the work to which he had given so much of his life, leaving it a fugitive and dishonoured. The blaze of lights, the screaming of the great ferry boats, all the triumphant brazen noises of the mighty city sounded like a requiem to him as in the darkest part of the promenade deck he leaned over the railing and nursed his agony, the supreme agony of an ambitious man. Failure. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37. "What has become," Mrs. Theodore Hastings asked her niece one afternoon about a month later, "of your delightful friend Mr. Lutchester?" Pamela laid down her book and looked across at her aunt with wide open eyes. "Why, I thought you didn't like him, Anne." "I cannot remember saying so, my dear," Mrs. Hastings replied. "I had nothing against the man himself. It was simply his attitude with regard to some of your uncle's plans, of which we disapproved." Pamela nodded. They were seated on the piazza of the Hastings country home at Manchester. "I see. And uncle's plans," she went on reflectively, "have become a little changed, haven't they?" Mrs. Hastings coughed. "There is no doubt," she admitted, "that your Uncle Theodore was inveigled into supporting, to a certain extent, a party whose leaders have shown themselves utterly irresponsible. The moment these horrible things began to come out, however, your uncle finally cut himself loose from them." "Very wise of him," Pamela remarked. "Who could have believed," Mrs. Hastings demanded, "that men like Oscar Fischer, Max Bookam, and a dozen other well-known and prominent millionaires would have stooped to encourage the destruction of American property and lives simply through blind devotion to the country of their birth? I could understand," she went on, "both your uncle and I perfectly understood that their sympathies were German rather than English, but we shared a common belief that, notwithstanding this, they were Americans first and foremost. It was in this belief that your uncle was led into temporary association with them." "Bad luck," Pamela sighed. "I am afraid it hasn't done Uncle Theodore any good." Mrs. Hastings went on with her knitting for a moment. "My child," she said, "it has probably imperilled, if it has not completely ruined, one of the great hopes which your uncle and I have sometimes entertained. We are both of us, however, quite philosophical about it. Even at this moment I am convinced that if these men had acted with discretion, and been content to wield political influence rather than to have resorted to such fanatical means, they would have represented a great power at the next election. As things are, I admit that their cause is lost for the time. I believe that your uncle is contemplating an early visit to England. He is of the opinion that perhaps he has misunderstood the Allied point of view, and he is going to study matters at first hand." Pamela nodded. "I think he is very wise, aunt," she declared. "I quite expect that he will come back a warm advocate of the Allies. No one would have a ghost of a chance who went to a country here on the other ticket." "I believe that is your uncle's point of view," Mrs. Hastings assented. "Why don't you ask Mr. Lutchester down for a couple of days?" "If you mean it, I certainly will," Pamela agreed. "Quite incidentally," her aunt continued, "I heard the nicest possible things about him in Washington. Lady Ridlingshaw told me that the Lutchesters are one of the oldest families in England. He is a cousin of the Duke of Worcester, and is extraordinarily well connected in other directions. I must say he has a most distinguished appearance. A well-bred Englishman is so different from these foreigners." Pamela laid down her book and drew her writing block towards her. "I'll write and invite him down at once," she suggested. "Your uncle will be delighted," Mrs. Hastings purred. Lutchester received his invitation in New York, and arrived in Manchester 3 days later. Pamela met him at the station with a couple of boatmen by her side. "If you wouldn't mind sailing home," she proposed. "The house is practically on an island, and the tide is just right. These men will take your luggage." They walked down to the little dock together. Pamela talked all the time, but Lutchester was curiously tongue-tied. "You'll find Uncle Theodore and Aunt too most amusing," she confided. "It is perfectly obvious that there is nothing Uncle regrets so much as his temporary linking up with Fischer and his friends. In fact, he is going to Europe almost at once. I am convinced for no other reason than to give him an excuse, upon his return, for blossoming out as a fervent supporter of the Allies." "Are you going too?" Lutchester inquired. "Shall I?" "Well, I am not really sure," she declared as they reached the little wooden dock. "I suppose I shall, especially if I can find something to do. I may even turn nurse." "You will be able to find plenty to do," he assured her. "If nothing else turns up,
You can help me." They stepped onto the yacht. Pamela, a radiant vision in white, with white flannel skirt, white jersey and tam o' shanter, took the helm, and was busy for a few moments getting clear. Afterwards she leaned back amongst the cushions, with Lutchester by her side. "In the agitation of missing that buoy," he reminded her, "you forgot to answer my last suggestion." "Is there any way in which I could help you?" she asked. "You can help me in the greatest of all ways," he replied promptly. "You can give me just that help which only the woman who cares can give to the man who cares for her. And if that isn't exciting enough," he went on, after a moment's pause, "well, I dare say I can find you some work in the censors department." "Isn't censoring a little dull?" she murmured. "Then you choose." Her hand slipped into his. A little breeze filled their sails at that moment. The wonderful blue water of the bay sparkled with a million gleams of sunshine. Lutchester drew a great breath of content. "That's Aunt on the landing stage, watching us through her glasses," Pamela pointed out, making a feeble attempt to withdraw her hand. "It will save us the trouble," he observed, resisting her effort of explanations. Lutchester found his host and hostess unexpectedly friendly. They even accepted with cheerful philosophy the news that Lutchester's work in America was almost finished for the time, and that Pamela was to accompany him to Europe almost immediately. After dinner, when the two men were left at the table, Hastings became almost confidential. "So far as regards the sympathies of this country, Mr. Lutchester," he said, "the final die has been cast within the last few weeks. There has always been," he proceeded, "a certain irritation existing between even the Anglo-Saxon Americans and your country. We have fancied so often that you have adopted little bits of superiority towards us, and that your methods of stating your intentions have not always taken account of our own little weaknesses. Then America, you know, loves a good fight, and the Germans are a wonderful military people. They were fighting like giants whilst you in England were still slacking. But it is Germany herself, or rather her sons and friends, who have destroyed her chances for her. Fischer, for instance," he went on, fingering his wineglass. "I have always looked upon Oscar Fischer as a brilliant and far-seeing man. He was one of those who set themselves deliberately to win America for the Germans. A more idiotic bungle than he has made of things I could scarcely conceive. He has reproduced the diplomatic methods which have made Germany unpopular through the world. He has tried bullying, cajolery, and falsehood, and last of all he has plunged into crime. No German American will henceforth ever have weight in the councils of this country. I do not mind confessing," Mr. Hastings continued, as he himself filled his guest's glass and then his own, "that I myself was at one time powerfully attracted towards the Teuton cause. They are a nation wonderful in science, wonderful in warfare, with strong and admirable national characteristics. Yet they are going to lose this war through sheer lack of tact, for the want of that kindliness, that generosity of temperament, which exists and makes friends in nations as in individuals. The world for Germany, you know, and hell for her enemies. But I am keeping you." Lutchester drank his wine and rose to his feet. "Pamela is sitting on the rocks there," Mr. Hastings observed. "I think that she wants to sail you over to Misery Island. We get some unearthly meal there at 10 o'clock and come back by moonlight. It is a sort of torture which we always inflict upon our guests. My wife and I will follow in the launch." "To Misery Island," Lutchester repeated. His host smiled as he led the way to the piazza steps. Pamela had already stepped into the boat, and with the help of a boatman was adjusting the sail. She waved her hand gaily and pointed to the level stretch of placid water, still faintly brilliant in the dying sunlight. "You think that we shall reach Misery Island before the tide turns?" she called out. Lutchester stepped lightly into the boat and took the place to which she pointed. "I am content," he said, "to take my chance." This is the end of The Pawn's Count by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.